Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production on YouTube, and welcome to another Friday review. And today I am here to review Deep Gashes and Long Lashes, which is the sixth studio album from Canadian Grindcore slash maybe death metal band, and very experimental band at that. VHS. Now this is actually, it's going to be released through Horror Pain Gore Death Productions on October 31st. That, of course, is Halloween Day, and that's this Monday. So this is actually probably the first album review on this channel, at least the first album in general that I'm reviewing here, that doesn't get dropped on a Friday, but instead gets dropped on a Monday. So that's pretty crazy. And again, this was one that was sent to me as a promo via my Gmail account from, of course, Horror Pain Gore Death Productions. So without further ado, let me get into my overall thoughts on Deep Gashes and Long Lashes from VHS. So here we go, folks. Okay, before I really get into, well, my overall thoughts on this album from VHS, which actually stands for, just a real quick here, hey, damn it, I'm going back here real quick. Violent Homicidal Slasher is what it actually stands for. VHS, again, just to let you know, VHS, of course, the band name, it should give you, and even the cover art and everything should give you a very good indication where their inspirations, especially for the lyrical ideas and the themes, come from. Again, it's a very much a homage and tribute to classic horror movies from the 70s to the 80s and possibly the 90s and so on, but for the most part, it's probably 80s horror movies, but obviously this album is going to be one of the few exceptions. But there we go. Again, before I really get into my, my overall thoughts, like I was pretty much beginning, you know what I have to do. I have to do a track listing rundown so I can tell you folks where the songs are on this album, how many songs are on this album, and what's the time length for this album. And since there's at least 10 songs here, it all clocks in at the length of 28 minutes and 53 seconds. So these 10 songs are beginning with I Want Your Eyeball, the title track, Filthy Slimy Pervert, Fear Murder Obsession, Solange, Quack Quack, Six Women for the Murder, Deep Red, Witch, and then finally ending with Murder Witness Through Hallucinogens. So there you go, folks. There's your 10 songs. Now, probably just like you, I am, of course, I'm very new to VHS. I don't think I might have seen them pop up on Bandcamp once in a while whenever I do during my free time, go on the Bandcamp and look for a couple of, maybe brand new bands or whatever, and I probably have seen them pop up before, but I might have taken here and there maybe a small snippet of their music, but again, not really anything that would have made me actively listen to it from beginning to end. That's, of course, changed thanks to Horror Pain Gore Death Productions. So where am I at here? Since I've never really listened to an entire album of theirs, this is very different to me, and this really might be very different for me because I have reviewed plenty of releases thanks to people like, let's say, Paul of Doomsday Records and so on, who have sent me some really interesting things that kind of pushes my comfort zone a little, or pushes me out of my comfort zone and kind of puts me in a much more different space than I'm comfortable in. But in a way, it tests me. It tests me to see if maybe this might do something for me. Maybe, again, it will open up my horizons to something brand new. And that's kind of a similar case here with this album right here from VHS, that being Deep Gashes and Long Lashes. So, since, again, I am not familiar with any other albums, I'm just going to have to go by what I thought of this album right here. And before I really get into any further into me describing the music on this album, I need to, of course, run through the various many themes that this, or at least the main theme that this album indeed is inspired by, and that's classic giallo films of the 1970s and 1980s. And if you're not, of course, an Advent follower or just not as experienced within the horror movie genre, there's a lot of subgenres. I mean, I'm not going to go through a lot of them, but there's plenty of ones out there. I mean, horror is almost like metal and possibly even like rock music. It's definitely a subform, but there's just so many different subgenres because there are just bands have came up with so many different styles. Horror is that same way here, and there are just so many different horror movie genres out there. Again, psychological horror, slasher films, supernatural horror movies, or just even suspense horror, whatever, or of course you've got your gore porn movies, and which again, it's just movies that just rely on a lot of gore and everything. You have the splatter films, again, all rely on gore, and that kind of still probably falls under the line of gore porn, but which is what everybody tends to refer to that as because of all about the gore, which is almost not very too stripped away. It's not too far off from, let's say, something like death metal or grindcore, or even some of the more brutal thrash metal bands or brutal death metal, where it's all about being as brutal as you can. It's the same way with the splatter horror movies. So there's just so many different subgenres of horror. However, giallo is actually a sub-form of horror that is mostly respected to the Italian sort of horror movies. Again, it's kind of a similar thing, let's say, with like krautrock, which is, well, mostly referred to prog bands or very experimental rock bands from Germany, that sort of subsect. That's kind of the term that you use for mostly bands from Germany to an extent. So that's kind of what giallo is to horror movies. It's the Italian subgenre of horror. And it can be, and thing is, sometimes it's not always just horror movies. It can be other different style of movies, where it be suspense films, or it could be crime to an extent, throwing in a little bit of that. But for the most part, it does rely on a bit of horror aspects, and that is indeed what giallo ends up being. And that's what the band VHS decided to come up with for their album here, is be very much themed by a lot of the giallo horror movies, or just giallo films in general from the 70s to 80s, so the Italian. So this is going to go when it comes to many of the names I'm going to run through that are very respected and are the most notable names. I'm going to be talking about directors here that are very much associated with the giallo genre. That being, of course, Dario Argento, Umberto Lenzi, Mario Bava, Lucio Fulci, Buyo Omega, and you know what? I think I just ran through most of them right there, but those are pretty much some of the obvious names I can bring up. Some of those in there might be a little bit obscure, but those are your main directors that are known for being associated with the giallo genre. And this is what this album pays tribute to and homage to, whatever. This is what it does. And you can even tell by some of the titles on here. I mean, I Want Your Eyeball is obviously a reference to Lucio Fulci's Zombie 2, which in Italy, it was actually titled Zombie 2 because it was seen as a kind of a sequel, though it really isn't that much of a sequel. It's very unofficial in its own right to like Dawn of the Dead, which again is George A. Romero. But here in the United States, and I think in other places, it got titled something else. Here in the United States, it was actually titled as Zombie, because again, it actually is the first movie in a series of movies that kind of dealt with zombies to an extent, though went crazy. Like Zombie 3 is basically here probably like Zombie 2, actually. Though I don't know how the hell that kind of comes into play, but still, I think as it went on, it started getting a little bit homogenized, and it started kind of taking off from far from the beaten path to what the original idea was for Zombie. They just tacked the name onto it and probably filmed a couple of others maybe just to fit in with the title, and yet the entire story would be something completely different. But still, that's, I believe, is what the first track is a reference to. Not sure about Deep Gashes, Long Lashes, but it obviously, I mean, that being the title track, obviously has to be a reference to, of course, some of the more popular Giallo titles. And of course, other ones I could run through, because again, I'm not quite as much, I don't know if you can call me much of a huge expert on the Giallo genre and its films, so I really can't really tell you the entire most of the song titles here are like references to. I really can't really tell you exactly what they could be references to, but there are just some that pop out at me that I know probably exactly what they could be a reference to, and there's some that are so fucking obvious. I mean, for example, Deep Red is obviously taken straight from the Dario Argento movie title of the same name, which is actually the English translation for it, but it was originally given an Italian title, and already I think Profondo Rosa, I think, is the Italian title for the movie Deep Red. Again, how I know that is because of the album that Goblin released, which is actually the first under the Goblin name before, after going from Cherry Red to that. Which again, apparently this sound does pay some tribute to, of course, is to guys like Claudio Simonetti and probably all the other members that are part of Goblin and / Cherry Red. The band name, and again, one of Italy's probably biggest prog rock band to begin with, or just prog band in general. They were probably their biggest there, but they were mostly known for providing soundtrack, or at least music for some of Dario Argento's movies, and of course, like the Italian version of Dawn of the Dead. Again, the Italian cut. I think Argento's cut of that movie, because again, that's a whole other thing I shouldn't get into too much, because again, it kind of takes away the actual context or the oh god damn it, it just it kind of moves the topic a little bit out of off topic. But again, I'm just bringing up a lot of references to kind of give you up to speed of what this stuff is probably, just to get a bit more of an understanding and to make things more, at least as clear as I can. And again, they were just bands that just, again, on topic of like Goblin, they just did that. But there's been plenty of different versions now of Goblin, because most of some of the members had either left and formed another version of Goblin because of they ended up for years not being on the same page, whatever, and that began in like the early 80s, whatever. They just all broke apart. Sometimes they would do reunions, sometimes now these days there's 2 different like versions of like Goblin, or 3 different versions at this point. It's unbelievable. But again, musically, sometimes, I mean, the synth part, supposedly is to an extent maybe inspired by Claudio Simonetti and Goblin, but I'll get more on that as soon as I can. But the kind of, to continue on, I know obviously for fact that the track Witch here is obviously a reference to Suspiria, which is obviously Dario Argento's biggest movie to date. That is his most well known. And they really, I mean, it's so obvious. Even for as guttural as the guy sings in, the voice, I still can tell what he's singing about. It's obviously about Suspiria. And yes, it's pretty cool to an extent, because I've rated in the past Suspiria as one of my absolute favorite horror movies to begin with. It's actually the one horror movie that actually scared the shit out of me as a kid. Literally. And I know you're probably wondering, how did you even see that as a kid? Really, it's just violent to begin with, but also it really kind of, to this day, it still kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies at times. It's just because of Goblin's music and everything, and that what they were able to come up with is what really kind of adds to the atmosphere and the very density and the almost nerve-wracking experience of that film. They just took it to another high with that. But again, they're paying tribute to that, and I don't know what Murder Witnessed Through Hallucinogens is a reference to. My sort of guess is probably they a reference to either two Argento titles. That could be Phenomena, or maybe possibly Four Flies on Grey Velvet. But I can't really completely recall on that because, again, those are only two of the obvious ones I can think of. But maybe one of the members might end up, coming across this album review here, and they might, hopefully, they at least chime in the comments section, and hopefully any of you do chime in on what it's about. And if you are watching it, like, any of the band members, if you are watching this, let me know what Murder Witness Through Hallucinogens is a reference to. There we go. That's about it. Those are the ones I can kind of at least can talk on, or at least can chat on in a way, Those are the ones I can at least can take a very good guess, and some I can tell you exactly what they are a reference to. But there's plenty of other titles here that I'm not quite as well refined in knowing what they are a reference to, because again, the giallo genre there's plenty of different films within this, and I don't have a lot of time to watch a whole bunch of them, but I know there's a lot of them out there. I know my brother probably has most of some of these, and he might get a better idea of what some of these are to begin with. But that's about it. But I'm going to move on to the actual music now, because this might be the shortest part of the review now, is the music itself. While I may not be as... let's just say I am not nearly as familiar with anything they did beforehand, so I really can't comment on how different this is, but I know that from first listen of this album, this really is a very experimental album, and there are parts of me that almost kind of questions on if you can't tag this as either thrash metal, death metal, or grindcore. Well, it's got most of those elements in here. It is very experimental because it plays around with a lot of keys, and it's very mid-pace. It's not too fast, though. It's been a while, but I know that I recall that most of these are not too fast. They're not blast beat ridden, so that could be a plus for some people that may not be into that. But there's going to be most parts of this to begin with that probably still will not, maybe, attract you to want to really give this a full listen. And I get that. And this one really kind of pushed me a little bit. It really it tested me, like I always say, because of albums like this it's really good to have albums like this, because if it actually kind of makes you really go, and it really kind of tests your genre tasting in a way, your preferences, and takes you out of your comfort zone, and it puts you into something a little different. And it makes you think that maybe at first listen, this is not going to get you, but at some point you're probably going to come back to this one, and it will probably make you go and think that, I didn't know music can be done this way. And it starts to kind of take you now on a much different road, and it wants to make you check out other bands that might be similar to this. So in a way, it tries you, and that's a good thing, because of me, I have such an open mind that I can kind of sit here and listen to it and and maybe see if it will do something for me. And sometimes, again, if you come back a year or two later and give another listen, that's when it might begin to grow on here. And that's probably what's going to happen with this one with me, is that it's probably going to take a lot of time to grow on me. And it's not going to grow on me within a couple of listens. This is one of those where I need to take a year or two to really kind of give this sound to really kind of sink in and come back to it and see if it does anything for me. Because of this is a little different at times, because normally I am more used to the more traditional styles of like grindcore, death metal, and thrash metal. And this one is they push it to a little bit out of that comfort zone, and they experiment with it by adding a lot of the synth keys, which supposedly are again homage to like Goblin and so on. But I've listened to a shit ton of Goblin, and I've listened to even like the more offshoots of Goblin from some of the ex-members of the band, like Claudio Simonetti and all of those. I think have done their own versions of Goblin, and I know exactly what is the right synth tone for Goblin, because the synth tone that they're using for this obviously is a Moog synth sound, which again was very popular within a lot of composers in like the 70s to the 80s. They used the Moog synth for a lot of some of these horror movies, and now with a lot of retro style horror movie directors these days that are doing movies that are kind of giving you that again, are kind of give that nostalgic feel, or do films in that same sort of vein, and have done scores that use the Moog synth because they want to kind of give it that natural, that almost authentic, very vintage feel to it, and atmosphere. And again, I love me the Moog, but Goblin, I don't think have you ever really used the fucking Moog synth, because of I know exactly what it sounds like, and theirs is almost, it's like keys or something. There is more unique, and it really fit the prog tone, because again, Goblin and Claudio Simonetti, they played prog, and when they did or composed their soundtracks, it obviously was being done through the lens of a prog musician and a prog rock writer. And that's kind of what I've always looked at those, and that's what kind of gives Goblin their sound, is because of it's definitely horror movie composing soundtrack stuff, but it's just done through the lens of a prog rock musician. And I mean, just listen to like the entire Profonda Rosa soundtrack again for Deep Red. Listen to that; it is definitely prog rock, and that's what to me is what Goblin is. It's just prog rock on the very dark, and at times very not too heavy, but it's dark and very sinister sounding, and that to me is what is Goblin. And this is not what that is for me with Deep Gashes and Long Lashes. The synth sound they're using, again, it to me sounds like a traditional Moog synth, and it is not the ones that I know that the guys of Goblin have ever used. Because again, I who knows, that may have been the point, and I don't think they wanted to go in that sort of Goblin direction, or at least use any of the instruments, or some of the instruments that they've used to infuse within their thrash or death metal sound, whatever. And that would have been fucking awesome if they actually were able to do that. I would love to hear at least an extreme metal band that uses some of the Goblin instrumentation and some of the instruments that they use and infuse it within their sound. And I would love more of that. That would be freaking great. But this is not that. And not trying to knock the music because it's not that. It's just, again, I've got my little bit of pet peeves or nitpicks, whatever, at times, because of me. I'm so familiar with their music now, again, for Goblin, that I know exactly what the instruments are supposed to sound like. And this is not that. But it's still cool, and I respect and admire the effort that they put into this. So that's all I'm going to say on that. So, again, it's a pretty enjoyable one. Again, the vocals are very standard of the genre, but they do a decent job. And everyone else, I think, probably were having a lot of fun doing it. And I can tell they're having fun doing it. And is what matters here, and I can appreciate a lot of that. It's just right now, this is why I'm not too harsh on this, because that's kind of a great thing. Like when it comes to some of the albums that I've got in my Krautrock, albums collection, whatever, that are more rock based or prog based, it took me a few years to really kind of let those albums really kind of click with me, and that's gonna be the same thing with this one. So right now, you're kind of getting my real first impression, and this is a really good first impression because of it definitely sounds like this is gonna be one of those that at some point is going to completely click with me, and it's going to, obviously, it's going to take me down to the VHS path, and I'm just going to check out everything they've ever done, you know. But right now, not so much, but I'm glad that I got around to listen to this, and I think this might be a very interesting thing for any of you to check out. So if you have an open mind and want to kind of branch out to something else, check out Deep Gashes and Long Lashes from VHS. So there you go, folks. I know this might be, for any of these kind of releases, pretty long, but again, when there's something that I know I actually have some pretty good knowledge in, to an extent. I mean, I'm not calling myself a fucking expert, so don't try and go in the comments and like, oh, you're just some wannabe expert. Don't, because I'm not trying to make myself out to be an expert. I'm just kind of giving you my affiliations or just my brushes with some of this stuff. And I do got some decent knowledge, but not an amazing amount of knowledge. But I do know some of the stuff enough to kind of give you some good references and give you at least my reference point and where I compare the stuff to. So that's what I'm able to kind of do with what I'm able to remember and think of. So that's, I hopefully all of you take as. So there we go. But I'm not going to give this a rating because the fact that this is a pretty interesting first impression for me, and obviously this is going to be one of those that's going to take some really time, and I'm going to take a year or so probably to really kind of click with me and really make me go, because I'm not saying that I did not like this album. It's just that it's one of those where I need to kind of take some time to really wrap my head around an album like this. And I'm not trying to make it out like it's something completely different. It's just that what they do with these ingredients for this album is just something that isn't quite as something that I'm familiar with. And it's going to take a lot of time for me to become more familiar with this kind of stuff. And it's going to take me a couple of years or so to really kind of become very familiar with this. So that's where I'm going to leave it at that. So again, I'm going to leave you a link to, of course, the Bandcamp page where you can buy this or listen to this, and whenever it gets dropped on Monday, which is Halloween, October 31st. So with that, I hope all of you enjoyed. This is Temper Thrash saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.